On the night of March 8, 2025, the port of Feodosia appeared untouchable. Crimea's largest cargo terminal hummed with activity as cranes moved containers onto waiting vessels and military trucks delivered supplies destined for Russian forces along the southern front. Moscow had spent years fortifying this location with overlapping air defense systems that created what commanders called an impenetrable shield. However, that sense of security was about to collapse in a sequence of events that would reshape the naval balance in the Black Sea. Deep in Ukrainian territory, Neptune cruise missiles were being prepared for launch in absolute secrecy. Stay with us as we reveal how a single coordinated strike turned Russia's most defended port into a burning wreck and exposed fatal weaknesses in a system designed to stop exactly this kind of attack. The fortress defense. Feodosia had been transformed into one of the most heavily defended locations in occupied Crimea. The port handled military cargo that moved constantly between the mainland and the peninsula, including fuel, ammunition, and vehicles. Russian planners understood that losing this facility would force a massive rerouting of supplies through the Kerch Bridge, already strained from previous Ukrainian strikes. To prevent that scenario, they built a defensive network designed to intercept any threat before it could reach the coastline. The layered defense began with Panzer S-1 units forming the inner ring, equipped with surface-to-air missiles and rapid-fire cannons. Behind them stood Taur's M2 batteries that added a second interception layer. Further inland, S-300V for launchers covered the approaches from the sea, creating overlapping fields of fire. At the highest tier sat multiple S-400 batteries positioned on elevated terrain northwest of the city, operating with advanced radars capable of tracking targets at extreme distances. Russian officers believed this arrangement created a kill zone extending in all directions. The confidence came from doctrine and training. Crews practiced engagement sequences and simulated responses to cruise missile attacks. However, this confidence created its own vulnerability because the defensive posture relied on assumptions about how attacks would develop. Commanders expected threats at medium or high altitude, where long-range radars performed best, and these expectations shaped how crews allocated their attention. This mental framework left the system blind to approaches operating outside those assumptions, and Ukrainian intelligence had been studying these blind spots for months. The intelligence operation. Ukrainian military intelligence had been collecting information on Feodosia's defenses since the early months of occupation. Signals intelligence units monitored radio transmissions between radar stations and command posts, tracking communication patterns that revealed shift changes and alert status updates. Electronic warfare teams deployed receivers along the coast to capture radar emissions, analyzing frequencies and beam patterns to map coverage zones and identify angles where radar performance degraded. Commercial satellite imagery provided another critical layer. High-resolution photos documented the exact positions of radar installations and launcher platforms. Analysts noted that the S-400 batteries positioned on high ground created blind zones in the low-altitude airspace directly over the water. Thermal imaging showed which structures generated heat signatures consistent with active military operations. Reconnaissance drones refined this intelligence through deliberate probing missions that tested Russian response times. These flights confirmed that Russian crews prioritized high-value targets and often ignored slower-moving objects. By late February 2025, all of this intelligence converged into a detailed strike plan. Ukrainian planners identified a specific time window when crew alertness would be lowest and designed a flight path that kept the Neptune missiles below the effective detection threshold while approaching from an angle that maximized terrain masking. The launch site sat concealed beneath a canopy of trees in Ukrainian-controlled territory. The Neptune battery had been moved into position 3 days earlier under darkness, camouflaged with netting and vegetation. On the night of March 8, the launch crew completed final preparations in silence. Technicians programmed the flight path into each missile's navigation computer, entering waypoints that would guide the weapon along a calculated route over the Black Sea. At 0247 local time, the launch command was transmitted. The first missile ignited and erupted from its tube, climbing rapidly into the night sky. The other 3 followed in sequence, each accelerating as its engine reached full thrust. Once airborne, the missiles climbed briefly to allow their navigation systems to stabilize, then nosed over and began a controlled descent. they dropped until they leveled off just meters above the surface of the Black Sea. Flying at this height transformed the missiles into nearly invisible threats. The sea surface disrupted radar waves, bending them upward and away from low-flying objects. The missiles maintained a speed of approximately 850 km per hour, creating a narrow margin for interception. As the missiles raced across the dark water, the next phase of the operation was already beginning far above them. The distraction. The swarm of Ukrainian drones lifted into the sky from multiple launch points, each programmed to converge on Feodosia from different directions. Their purpose was not to inflict damage but to overwhelm the Russian air defense network. As the drones approached the outer detection range, they began appearing on Russian screens as dozens of separate contacts. The drones did not maintain steady courses. Some climbed and descended unpredictably, causing radar returns to flicker. Others flew in tight circles, forcing tracking systems to constantly recalculate trajectories. Russian commanders responded by activating defensive batteries at maximum alert. Panzer units engaged the closest drones with missiles and cannon fire. Farther out, Tor systems locked onto drone groups, launching interceptors that detonated in bright flashes. The sustained barrage consumed ammunition and attention at an accelerating rate. Operators focused on the upper airspace layers where the most visible targets maneuvered. Meanwhile, the lower altitude band where the Neptune missiles flew remained largely ignored. The defensive network was not configured to prioritize this layer because radars performed poorly at such low angles. This coverage gap, combined with the distraction, opened a corridor through which the missiles could pass undetected. The strike. The first two Neptune missiles reached the Crimean coastline, and their imaging infrared seekers activated. The sensors searched for specific thermal patterns programmed during mission planning, including radar antenna arrays and missile launch tubes. The seeker on the first missile quickly identified the 92N6E fire control radar. The rectangular antenna emitted a steady thermal signature that matched the stored template. The missile climbed slightly for a terminal dive that would maximize impact. The second missile seeker located the S-400 launch tubes positioned adjacent to the radar. The cylindrical shapes produced their own heat signature, amplified by the missiles inside them. Both weapons entered their terminal phase within seconds of each other, accelerating as they descended. The Russian crews had no warning. Their radars remained focused on the drone swarm, and their attention was consumed by continuous engagements. The first missile struck the radar with devastating precision. The warhead tore through the antenna structure and ripped apart the electronics. The radar went silent instantly, blinding the long-range defensive layer. The second missile hit the launcher position moments later, destroying at least 3 vertical launch tubes and triggering secondary detonations. With the long-range defenses neutralized, the final 2 missiles approached the port without resistance. Their seekers identified the fuel storage tanks on the eastern edge, large structures filled with refined petroleum. The third missile locked onto the largest cluster and descended vertically. The warhead struck the upper section and detonated, tearing through the shell and igniting the fuel inside. The explosion produced a massive fireball that rose hundreds of meters, illuminating the entire port. The fourth missile targeted a separate tank filled with diesel. The impact triggered another explosion that sent flames shooting skyward and generated thick black smoke. The fire spread through the network of pipes and pumps, rupturing fuel lines and igniting pools of spilled petroleum. Within minutes, the entire storage complex was engulfed in flames that would burn for hours. The follow-on wave. With the air defense network crippled, Ukrainian forces launched the next phase. A new swarm of drones approached Feodosia from multiple directions, carrying explosive payloads. The loss of S-400 radar coverage meant Russian forces could no longer detect these drones at long range. The drones spread across the port like a coordinated assault. Some targeted container yards where military cargo awaited transport, striking armored vehicles and supply containers. Other drones focused on crane infrastructure, collapsing several cranes into twisted wreckage that blocked loading docks. Additional drones moved toward administrative buildings and command centers, disrupting the coordination systems. The combined impact of the missile strikes and drone wave created destruction that exceeded expectations. The port was rendered completely non-functional. The fuel storage capacity was gone, the cargo handling infrastructure wrecked, and the air defense network destroyed. Russian commanders confronted a reality they had not anticipated. Even heavily defended positions deep inside occupied territory were vulnerable to coordinated Ukrainian strikes. The aftermath. The Russian Ministry of Defense issued a statement claiming air defense forces had intercepted 47 Ukrainian drones and that damage was minimal. However, commercial satellite imagery released later contradicted this entirely. The photos showed scorched earth where the S-400 position had been, with destroyed launch tubes and a blackened crater. At the port, ongoing fires and plumes of black smoke rose from multiple locations. Local authorities declared a state of emergency and imposed movement restrictions. The governor acknowledged that several port sections would remain closed indefinitely. These measures confirmed the damage was far more severe than officials admitted. The attack exposed critical vulnerabilities in Russia's defensive posture. The reliance on high-altitude interception had left the lower airspace dangerously exposed. The loss of Feodosia's fuel capacity created immediate logistical problems for the Black Sea Fleet, forcing supply line rerouting through less efficient alternatives. Beyond immediate damage, the strike demonstrated a shift in Ukraine's capabilities, showing that defended ports across Crimea might be equally vulnerable. The strategic impact. The destruction created cascading operational problems. The Black Sea Fleet faced immediate consequences as naval vessels were forced to travel longer distances for refueling, reducing operational tempo and limiting coastal patrols. Ground forces felt the impact as supplies had to be rerouted through already strained rail lines and roads, creating shortages at forward positions. The air defense network across Crimea underwent rapid reconfiguration. Russian commanders pulled remaining batteries farther inland, creating gaps in coastal coverage that Ukrainian drones exploited. The success at Feodosia also had psychological effects, demonstrating that occupied Crimea was not immune to Ukrainian strikes and undermining narratives about Russian air defense effectiveness. From a strategic perspective, the operation validated Ukraine's investment in domestically produced long-range strike capabilities. The Neptune system had proven effective in precision strikes against defended infrastructure, encouraging further development and forcing Russian planners to allocate more resources to defensive measures. What comes next? Just 4 days after Feodosia, new explosions rocked a fuel depot near Kerch. Russian authorities labeled it accidental, but satellite imagery showed blast patterns consistent with explosive impacts. The timing raised questions about whether Ukraine had launched a follow-on operation to further disrupt Russian logistics in Crimea. The pattern suggests a deliberate strategy to strangle Russian operations by cutting off access to refined petroleum. There are also indications that Ukraine is developing new Neptune variants with extended range, potentially threatening targets along Russia's southern coast that have remained out of reach. The Feodosia strike may represent a turning point in the Black Sea theater, where Ukraine's ability to strike deep into Russian-held territory threatens the operational foundations of Russian military power in the south. Stay with us as we continue tracking these developments in our next video. And remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts, so you never miss the next chapter in this rapidly evolving story.